Spiritual Direction from Dante, Avoiding the Inferno, a book by Father Paul Pearson of the Oratory. Canto 5. Topics. Some sins are more destructive than others. The power of passion. The human tendency to self-deception. And our weaknesses in the face of temptation. Which sins we consider the most heinous seem to shift over time and across different societies, sometimes shockingly so. But despite the theorizing of some theologians, we always appear to have a hierarchy. Sometimes that hierarchy is organized according to the shame that the sinful action brings, or the scandals they cause. Recently, the damage done to others has been the most important consideration. In the Middle Ages, the most important victim to take into account when weighing the gravity of his sin was, perhaps surprisingly, the sinner itself. Every sin could be analyzed according to how destructive it was of the sinner's own humanity. Is the rot something superficial, or is it the sinner that's rotten to the core? The circles come progressively smaller as we descend into hell in line 2. This is more than just a matter of geometry. More people are present on the upper terraces. The lesser sins are the more common ones. In the place of the image of a recording angel at St. Peter's Gate, here, at the gate of hell, we are presented with a judge of a very different sort. Minos is barely human, if human at all. He grunts like a bull rather than speaking. After hearing the sins, which he seems to take to delight in, the sin connoisseur, as it describes in line 9, in Isolin's lovely translation, he says, he wraps his tail around the sinner the number of times that corresponds with the number of levels the sinner must descend in hell. His tail seems to work as a beastly elevator, not merely marking the place the sinner belongs, but delivering the soul there. Emphasis here is on the dehumanizing effect of sin. Notice how much of the imagery, especially in the regions dealing with sins of passion, is beastly. Before we actually begin to talk about this beastliness of uncontrolled passion, the imagery has prepared us for the idea. We have entered a realm where unbridled passion rules. The souls here testify against themselves. We shall experience the general readiness of the souls here to talk about their sins with Dante. They seem to have no shame, only the desire for their stories to be heard and remembered. Minos says in line 19, "Watch how you enter and in whom you trust." Again, the imagery reminds us of the importance of trust and hope in the spiritual life. Hell is not only a place in which hope for our ultimate destiny is lost permanently, but also a place governed by deceit and lies. Satan, after all, is the prince of lies. We should be careful in accepting the statements made by the damned. They are so caught up in their sins that they often cannot help but justify them. Minos' words are a frightening warning, reminiscent of our own Lord's words, saying, "Don't be fooled by the broad and easy gate. The way to hell is easy. You might even say that it's all downhill from here. But that wide opening is really only one directional. Hell is easier to get into than it is to get out of." It certainly feels as though our passions drive us at times. Their power seems almost overwhelming and irresistible. But even though our passions are an essential aspect of our human nature, for we cannot be human without them, regardless of what the Stoics argue, it is also part of our nature as rational beings that our passion should operate in us under the direction of our reason, like horses guided by the driver of a carriage. In their proper place, passions give our actions power and drive, or horsepower. But if they are allowed to run on their own, without proper direction, Our actions become little different from those of brute animals. To allow our passions to rule is to abdicate our responsibility as human beings. Virgil silences another beast of hell by referring to the power of heaven. He doesn't request, but he commands and says, no questions. If we take him here as the personification of reason, he shows us the proper relationship between reason and the passions. The rational powers command, and the passions are intended to obey. This is the way our human nature is supposed to be ordered. It is, however, so different from the way we act most of the time, and it seems impossible even to imagine. This apparent impossibility is only the result of original sin, not the nature of our passions. This ordering of the passions is the goal toward which virtue brings us. The virtue trains the power of the soul, including the passions, to be conformed to our reason. Once Minos is quieted by Virgil's command, Dante can now hear wails of sorrow, like a wave pounding the shore. The sense of hearing once again takes the lead because we're back in darkness, a place where all light is struck dumb. The light, in particular the light of reason, has been completely overcome by passion. Like Dante wandering in the dark wood, souls given to their passions are a people that in darkness dwelt. In line 31, the souls are driven by a driving wind, a hellish cyclone that whisks them about and beats and buffets them. As with the neutrals, the imagery is one of passivity, of being driven by forces outside of oneself rather than by the reason God has given us as our guide. Like the neutrals, those who have given control of their lives over to their passions are leading a less than human existence. But although the imagery seems the same, there is an important difference. This force driving these souls is in their sin, is interior. Their own passions and desires are driving them. It might be inspired or moved by something outside of them, but it is pushing out from the inside. The neutrals were the weak victims of exterior influences. The passionate are weak, but succumb to an influence that is their own desire. Again, curses here are directed to God as though he were responsible for their sufferings. These seem to occur especially when they pass the ruined slope. This slope was caused by the earthquake at the time of Christ's death and during the harrowing of hell, when Jesus descended to the dead after his crucifixion to deliver the souls of the just from their waiting place. The limbus patrum, or bosom of Abraham, as we put it. These faithful souls could not enter heaven unless the price was paid for their sins. This atonement happened when Christ offered himself on the cross for us. Now he has come to announce to them that their time of waiting is over. His dramatic entry to deliver these souls and the resulting damage from the earthquake, as we shall see repeatedly, gives Dante and Virgil their pathway into the many circles of hell. So perhaps the cursing of these damned souls happens because this is where they entered their circle of hell. It reminds them of their fate. Perhaps it is also a reminder of God himself, whom they have abandoned by their sins and whom yet they blame for their predicament. The ruin is a reminder of the power of real love, the love that allowed our Lord to lay down his life for his friends. In line 39, here the lustful are punished, who made their reason subject to desire. This is obviously true of the lustful, but it is also true of all sins of passion. As they were driven by their lust in this life, so now they are driven by the wind that flings them this way and that, without any hope of release or rest. The image of the starlings driven by the wind is particularly interesting. The wind provides the force, but the wind only drives them because they themselves have spread their wings. Birds have the instinct to stay put in a windstorm. Their wings stay tucked in. and they are hidden away somewhere safe. This reminds us that one of the most important techniques for avoiding sins of the flesh is not putting yourself into occasions of sin. Spread your wings in a windstorm, and what do you expect? Of course, you will end up being carried away. Politicians have recently depended increasingly upon spin doctors, people who can take an event and sell it to the public in a very different way from what we would expect. The passions seem to have learned this strategy long ago. By painting our passions in a noble and appealing way, giving into them seems natural and fitting, almost glamorous. We might know in our minds that there is a real difference between love and simple sexual desire, but we would be hard-pressed to find that distinction clearly presented in worldly accounts. But this spinning happens inside our consciences as well, telling ourselves the most outrageous tales. We appear to fall for those stories on a regular basis. Self-deception is a uniquely human art form. In line 52, at Dante's request, Virgil identifies some of the souls punished there, including a great number of very famous lovers. But lover is in fact an inappropriate name for them. After all, they're not in hell for loving, but for lust, which is a very different thing. Dante does not seem to keep this distinction clearly in his mind, though. Perhaps we should not be surprised that someone who spent years writing love poetry might be carried away by such stories of love. Semiramis, Queen of Assyria, altered lust to just by rewriting laws to allow her to marry her own son. This introduction to the circle of the lustful is a clear example of the way passion leads us to set aside even the clear dictates of reason and strong sexual taboos. Dido committed suicide, but she's punished here. Dante must be presenting the idea that her true sin was lust. Having given herself over to that, she was so overwhelmed by the passion that she was not fully culpable for her suicide. Virgil doesn't hesitate to point out the seedy side of these characters and their lives. Dante doesn't seem to pick up on Virgil's tone, but looks on their fate with more sympathy than judgment, and thinks of the souls as those whom love has severed from our life on earth. When Dante speaks, it is of love, not lust. Is he still under the spell of the leopard who stalked him in the dark woods? He seems more a fellow sufferer than an objective observer of divine justice at work. Note his own reference to his sympathetic reaction in line 72 when he says, "A whelm of pity left me at a loss." God seems to permit Paolo and Francesca in line 80 to leave off their punishment to speak with Dante. It is important that he learn the lessons necessary for his salvation, and they have something essential to teach him. The two lovebirds are eager to grant Dante's request to come and tell him their story. Called in the name of their love, beg them by the love that drives them on. They are necessitated in coming to Dante. They are truly slaves of their passions. The souls in hell are, for the most part, very pleased to speak about what they are there for. They want to be heard. Today, they'd be on a talk show, bearing all. Reader beware, however, as in the case of Virgil's description of why souls are sent to limbo. The accounts these sinners offer often contain much self-justification and perhaps a good dose of self-deception. After all, the first effective sin in the Garden of Eden was for Adam and Eve to attempt to cover up, both literally and figuratively. By God's will, talking seems to give some sort of respite from the punishments they endure, as long as the wind falls in silence. In line 103, Francesca sees herself as a sort of victim of love. She says, "Love that allows no loved one not to love seized me." She did not decide. She was seized, captured by something far beyond her strength. And she uses the same verb to describe Paolo's role. As she talks, a very romantic tale is told, eliciting sympathy from most listeners. She displays no recognition of the disorder of her appetites, no contrition for the sin she committed, no repentance for the harm she did to her husband. Notice that she doesn't even really mention at first that the man who killed them was her husband. He is merely the man who quenched us of our lives. She is first a victim of the love that seized her, and then a victim of the husband who killed her. The extent of her self-absorption is amazing. Dante is moved with pity at the plight of the lovers. His head is bowed almost reverently as he listens, and he says, "What great desire, what sweet and tender thoughts have led these lovers to this woeful pass?" You can almost hear the tone of his voice in these words. This tells us something important about Dante. He is compassionate. He feels with them and for them because he too knows the power of the leopard. Dante's own problem with this sin becomes clear in the way he asks his questions. Well, how did it happen? What made love give way that you should know the truth of your desires? It was lust, not love, and it brought them to darkness, not truth. But Dante isn't here to share sad stories with unfortunate victims of cruel circumstances. He is here to learn that sin is freely entered into, disordered with respect to reason, and destructive of our happiness. The punishment they receive is fully just and fully embraced by Paolo and Francesca. He seems to be getting seriously off track in his course of studies. Even though it hurts to remember, the lovers just can't stop themselves from discussing the way it all happened. In line 27, as in the case with so many sins against purity, Paolo and Francesca's sin began almost innocently, with a married woman and her handsome brother-in-law reading tales of courtly love alone together. Well, that is perhaps not the most prudent way to spend a lonely, rainy afternoon with an attractive member of the opposite sex. And they're reading about Lancelot and Guinevere's affair. And they say, "We went pale as we caught each other's glance." But even then, there was a possibility of turning away. But on they read until they were imitating what they were reading. They spread their wings like the starlings in the wind. They say, "That day we did not read another page." Need I say more? Deep inside of our hearts, we know that we are supposed to act in accordance with principles. We know that we are not created to give in to every desire we experience. We recognize that caving into our passions is a sign of weakness, and weakness is distinctly unattractive. To cover up this uncomfortable awareness, we try to place blame elsewhere, somewhere else, anywhere else. The devil made me do it. Anything to avoid the brutal honesty expressed so memorably by Oscar Wilde when he said, "I can resist anything except temptation." In line 137, Paolo and Francesca blame the book. They blame the author, accusing him of being a panderer or pimp. Anything but taking responsibility for their own actions. They are victims right to the end. It is interesting that only Francesca speaks. This sort of victimhood would be far less appealing coming from a man. Paolo merely stands by silently, and she makes excuse after excuse for their fall into lust. Finally, Dante is so overwhelmed in line 140 that he loses consciousness. So much for manly strength. Lust has the power to make him lose his senses. He has been defeated, even humiliated, by the power of the leopard.